Thanks for having me here, and it's great to be here, especially in this part of the country. I really agree with Steve that it's time to have entrepreneurship spread across the entire country and actually across the entire world. I'm going to run through what we're seeing out in the world. I'm the founding executive director of Singularity University. That's my White House uniform. This is a little bit more the Silicon Valley outfit here. I've been building out Singularity for the last 6 years now, and before that I was the head of innovation at Yahoo, ran their incubator. And I found that if you try and do disruptive innovation in a big company, that the immune system of the organization will come and attack you. And there's some nods from people. I'm sure there's arrows in your backs from having that experience, because all of our organizational structures are built to withstand change and withstand risk. And now the higher order bit is disruptive change, and how do we integrate with that? And that's some of what I've been exploring for the last few years. We're based at NASA in Silicon Valley. We are founded primarily by Ray Kurzweil, who's been studying these accelerating technologies for several years now, and several decades, and Peter Diamandis, who many of you know of, who founded the X Prize Foundation. And we live off that curve. That's a logarithmic y-axis showing Moore's law. And Ray put that together, and he found that we've actually been doubling the price performance of computation for over 100 years. And the core observation that he came up with was that once you take a domain or a discipline or an industry area and you base it in information flow and you power it with information technologies, its price performance starts doubling every year or so. And most importantly, once it starts that doubling pattern, nothing shakes it off that path. It stays on that doubling pattern. We're now seeing several technologies, AI, robotics, 3D printing, nanotech, biotechnology, all moving at that same pace of change in a way that we've never seen it before. And so we've brought together many of the world's leading experts to think about this accelerating change. And how can you harness that pace of change to achieve big ends? This is our classroom environment. We bring the top young leadership in the world together. Every summer we have 80 students that come from 40 different countries. And we challenge them for half the summer. We give them an update on what's happening across all of these technologies. The second half of the summer, we say to them, go build a company or an NGO or a for-profit or nonprofit structure that would impact 1 billion people positively within 10 years, leveraging the acceleration inherent in these technologies. That's essentially our mission statement. This team from a few years ago looked at poverty, and they noticed that most of the roads in Africa get washed out during the wet season. Right? 85% of all the roads get washed out when it's raining. In the middle of the summer, Chris Anderson from Wired magazine came and did a talk on drones, and we're now very familiar with all of these quadcopter things. And they had the idea of why not use drones to move medicine and food around, especially where there are no roads. So they came up with this, what they call MatterNet. This is a drone delivering medicine and food to a camp in Haiti. What's interesting about these drones is one of these drones today can carry a 5-pound package about 10 miles. That's the range and capacity. But the underlying technologies are moving so fast, they're doubling in their capability every 9 months. So by the middle of next year, 10 pounds, by the end of next year, 20 pounds, and that scaling keeps going. And so in this case, they spotted this doubling pattern, layered a solution on top of it, and we expect the solution to scale along with the underlying technology. This in part inspired this project from Amazon. You may have seen this announcement on 60 Minutes last year. At the time, they had no such capability, but they managed to get the story on 60 Minutes the day before Cyber Monday, the biggest shopping day of the year, so their PR people were very happy. They've now put major investment into this, and we're thrilled to see that kind of validation. So essentially, that's what we're about. How do you make very disruptive change in a positive way using these accelerating technologies? What we're seeing out in the world today is kind of roughly 4 dynamics. The first is we're digitizing the world, right? Our memories, for example, aren't in our heads anymore. They're in our smartphones. All our relationships are digital via social networks rather than analog. And once you turn something digital, it hops onto that Moore's law pace of change and accelerates away, right? If you're below 30 years old today, the appearance of your Facebook profile is much more important than how you're dressed that day. And we can tell by how they're dressing these days that's actually the case. And essentially, we're turning all of that. And all of that is being powered by the sheer pace of computation. For those of you who have a smartphone, this smartphone has more computational power in it than the entire US government had at its disposal in the 1980s, right? So which is why it runs a bit hot. I mean, there's a lot of computational power in there. As we miniaturize all of that, we're getting to this entire Internet of Things concept. We had about 500 million connected devices on the internet 10 years ago. We're now up to about 9 billion. By the end of the decade, we'll be up to 50 billion. And shortly after that, you've seen these estimates where we're going to get to 1 trillion. Think about that, just that one estimate. We're going from 9 billion connected devices today to 1 trillion in a decade and a half or so. Right? We think we're 30, 40 years into the information revolution. On this particular metric, we're about 1% of the way there. We're literally just starting, right? And so most of this disruption is ahead of us. Once you start something on this information curve, it becomes entirely disruptive. And Steve mentioned Kodak, that we find photography is the best analogy for this for a different reason than you would think. Some of you are old enough to remember film photography in the room. And when you're operating from a material substrate, you're operating from a scarcity model. It costs about $1 a photograph, takes about a week to get your photographs back. And we take courses in photography to learn how to optimize every shot. And we're operating from a scarcity problem set. When you make the shift to digital photography and you change the substrate from a material basis to a digital basis, 2 or 3 interesting things happen. The first is that the marginal cost of an extra photograph goes to 0. Right? Now you can take 1,000 more photographs and it doesn't cost you anything. As a result, the domain absolutely explodes. If we went back about 20 years ago, there was about 1 billion film photographs processed here in the US that year. Today, we're uploading per day 1 billion film photographs, digital photographs, up to Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, et cetera. And you shift the problem space from a scarcity model to an abundance model. Now I have 1,000, now we have 10 copies of all our photographs on 8 different devices. Now you just can't find them all. And you can't find the good ones, and we have to filter them down, et cetera, et cetera. And then we use a whole set of other techniques, AI, machine learning, computation, modeling, simulation, and that drives the pace of change even further. And this explosion that we've seen from material film photography to digital photography and the explosion that resulted in the domain is essentially the same explosion we're now seeing across all of these technologies. 3D printing, many of you are familiar with. This is now exploding out of the gate. It's been doubling away very steadily for 35 years. It's not a new technology. But there are 2 inflection points that have it be really interesting. The first, if you look at the object on the top right, you can't mold that. And for the first time ever with 3D printer, you can replicate an object without a mold. Previously, you had to assemble that, and that was kind of a painstaking process, which is kind of an interesting thing to be able to do. More importantly, in 3D printing has transformed a traditional area of manufacturing, which is a more complex object in manufacturing always costs more. The design, the fabrication techniques, the materials, et cetera. For the first time ever, complexity is free. A 3D printer doesn't care if I'm spitting out the yellow thing in the middle or a more complex object around one of the edges there. In the same way that your inkjet printer does not care if you're printing out one letter or a whole novel, it's just spitting out the ink. And so we've now information-enabled manufacturing, and essentially an object is now a file with all of the other issues and possibilities that come from that. Here's a young lady that won a recent startup competition. She's devised a 3D printer for home where you literally pick colors and you print your own makeup at home. We know for you executives in the cosmetics business, they are freaking out about this. Because if you think of the entire value chain in cosmetics, all the brass and glass display booths in Macy's, et cetera, all fundamentally disruptable by this device, which you can now do at home. And this sheer pace of change is now having this disruption hit more and more industries. You're all familiar with these $20 helicopters that all the kids are playing with, right? 5 years ago, that same capability cost $700, right? 8 years ago, it wasn't possible. It was not possible to have that level of miniaturization, servo motor, gyro, et cetera, and now it's down to $20. And when it's $20, that many more people can play away, hack at it, et cetera, et cetera. How many of you are familiar with the Google car? Right, hopefully quite a few have heard of it. The Google car is an autonomous car that drives itself. This car has now, it uses light radar, LiDAR. You can see the unit there on the top of the car. This car has now done 750,000 miles on California streets and highways without an accident. Right? Most of us could not drive 750,000 miles without an accident. Okay? We think this is the biggest disruption that we will probably see in our lifetimes because our world and our society has been dominated by this concept of the car, and we're now about to change that. Most people think this paradigm is about 10 to 15 years away. We think it's about 3 to 5 years away. We thought for a few years we've been thinking the car's ready, because to drive a car you don't need artificial human intelligence, you need artificial horse intelligence, and we have that. And therefore the car, and this is version 1 that's been able to operate to this level. We thought the car was ready, but okay, it'll take a long time for a Department of Transport or for a DMV to actually authorize it. And then to our utter surprise, 2 years ago, the state of Nevada authorized autonomous vehicles. And we thought, okay, it's Nevada, they'll authorize anything in Nevada, so that's not that big a deal. But then Florida, because of all the senior citizens, California to stay up with technology. A month ago, California issued the first license plates for autonomous cars. The car company Uber has pre-ordered 2,500 of these. Right? I have a 3-year-old son. He will never get a driver's license. Right? Very fundamental changes happening. Today, real estate values spike very heavily in the middle of cities because it's so hard to get in and out. We predict that once you roll out this paradigm and it hits critical mass, we'll be able to increase the capacity of existing roads and highways about between 10 times to 15 times with no change in infrastructure, which will smooth out real estate values, for example. Lots of ripple effects. So we think just this one innovation will have a massive... The way to think about it is for the first time in 100 years, Moore's Law is now hitting transportation. And we'll see a steady doubling in this capability as time goes by. I'll touch on this last one, maybe the most dramatic one that we were seeing. It turns out the price performance of solar energy is on one of these doubling patterns. We are doubling the price performance of solar anywhere between 22 and 30 months today, and have been for quite a while. At this pace, we will have 100% of world energy supply deliverable by solar in 25 years. More importantly, because it continues on that doubling pattern, in 27 years you have 200%, in 29 years you have 400%, and it keeps going. Because it turns out if you actually add up all of the energy we have in all our fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, et cetera, around the world, that adds up to about 5 days of sunlight hitting the world. So you shift the conversation right away there from a scarcity problem to a conversion problem. And that conversion problem is on that pace. Here's a relative cost of solar compared to a lot of these other fuels over the last 30, 40 years, and you can see how dramatic it is. And that change will just keep going because of the information exponential that it's on. So we're very optimistic around solar and energy, and we think we'll hit. Now that'll cause some interesting geopolitical issues. The Middle East will have some interesting dynamics at play. This is why Russia's acting up right now. They've got about 20 years of shelf life in their oil and gas before it drops off a cliff. And so we're going to start to see very macroeconomic implications of all of these technologies. For example, a foundation of China's economy is assembling and shipping cheap plastic parts, right? In a few years, we'll all have a 3D printer at home or have access to a local Kinko's type model. What happens to the foundation of their economy? Or India, where I grew up, a big chunk of their economy is call centers. Because of AI and voice recognition, we 50% automated those. In another 3 years, they'll be 100% automated. Probably a robot with an Indian accent will answer your support call. Something like that will happen, right? And how will we deal with that? And so this disruption is quite profound because the technologies are all very sexy. But as Peter is fond of mentioning, we are all of our mechanisms, all of the structures that we use to run the world, our civics, our politics, our legal systems, healthcare, education, all designed for a world a few hundred years ago. Not for the world of today. Definitely not for 1 trillion sensors coming down the pike. We will actually have to re-architect every single one of those as we go forward. And we are simply not set up to absorb that pace of change. This is how badly we get this curve wrong. Vinod Khosla studied the exponential growth of mobile phones over the last 10 years. We've seen it go from 100 million mobile phones in the year 2000, doubling every year, to 6 billion mobile phones out there today. And he went back through that decade and asked the question, how well did the mobile industry expert analysts predict that pace of change? And in 2002, he looked at Gartner, Forrester, Jupiter, McKinsey, et cetera, and found they predicted 16% year-on-year growth. 2 years later, gone up 100%, so they're off by a bit. Yet in 2004, they predicted 14%. Doubled again in 2006, they predicted 12%. And you can see what's happening here. At every point on an exponential curve, the experts in the field will predict linearly. And this is a cognitive issue we have. We're very good at predicting linear change. We're very bad at predicting exponential change. Right? If I take 30 steps linearly, I'll get to the side of the room, and you can all project very well. Where am I, a third of the way or 2/3 of the way in that projection? If I take 30 doubling steps, 2, 4, 8, 16, at step 30, I've gone 1 billion meters. I'm 26 times around the world, which is a little further than the side of the room. Right? And we miss that intuition all the time. And so when you have an exponential curve, for a long time it looks linear, and we discount it. Then it hits the knee of the curve, everything goes crazy, and then we say, oh, black swan. But if you can spot it early, if you don't spot it, it comes and disrupts you. If you spot it early, it's the biggest opportunity you could ever imagine. Right? Now, one of the issues we have is a lot of our global challenges today are exponential in nature. The climate change is an exponential problem. The financial crisis, driven by the acceleration in the underlying derivatives and other instruments. Ebola is doubling every 3 weeks. So you have an exponential problem, but we're addressing it with linear solutions, and this is a structural issue that we have to address in our leadership around the world. All of our leadership structure is about predictability and scalability and efficiency, not disruption. Right? And so here's an example of how dramatic this can be. This is an event we do with Deloitte. 4 days, we bring the Fortune 500 CEOs together for 4 days and give them briefings on these technologies. We ask them beforehand, how aware are you of these technologies? And you might imagine 75% have little or no awareness of these breakthroughs. At the end of the 4 days, we ask them, how big of an impact will this have on your industries and when? Look at that top statistic. 80% agreed these would have a game-changing impact on their industries within 2 years. 100% within 5 years, and all of them had an urgent action item when they got back to the office. And that's the gap that we're trying to address. This is also having, from an economic perspective, a very big demonetization effect. Most new business models are information-based, as we've seen, right? And when you fully information enable an industry, you see these big drops in price, and the money leaves the system. The newspaper business trundled along, and all of a sudden, a 6x drops in revenues. The music business, right? 10x drop in revenues once the digital world hit. Note they call themselves the media industry. They're trying to sell the physical media. But actually, it's an information service, and when you can go from artist to listener with a YouTube video, all the intermediaries disappear. Ironically, the music business today is generating more income than ever, just not in the way we thought it would. And that's a typical pattern we tend to see. Netflix versus Blockbuster, same basic paradigm. And maybe the most powerful thing that we're seeing today is the sheer democratization of it. And this is where we get very excited. But from a business perspective, this is also a warning sign. This is Emiliano Kargiman. He's one of our alumni. He's been voted by our faculty the most likely to actually impact 1 billion people. He's floating up a cluster of nanosatellites about the size of a shoebox. And once he has a mesh cluster up there up in space, he'll be able to provide real-time video anywhere on Earth to a 3-foot resolution. Okay? His first 3 satellites have already launched. And he's doing this out of Argentina. And today we're seeing this disruptive innovation happen all over the world. Eric Mijakowski created the Pebble Watch. He went to 20 investors around Silicon Valley asking for $100,000 in equity funding. Finally put it up on Kickstarter, where you pre-purchase a product, and if enough people pre-buy it, it releases the money to you. He put this up on Kickstarter as a desperate ploy because he was running out of money. Looking for $100,000, 3 weeks later he had $3 million in the bank. And by the end of the campaign, he had $10 million in the bank. This tells you 2 or 3 things. The first is that all the investors were dead wrong because there really was market demand for this. More importantly, though, there's a very fundamental shift that's happened with this crowdfunding phenomena, which is if I can go and raise money this way, I don't need the investor. And the fundamental competitive advantage of Silicon Valley has just disappeared. Right? In fact, it gets even more interesting because today, if you come to me with an interesting idea and you say, hey, I want you to invest in me, the first thing I'm going to do is say, put it up on Kickstarter because I want to see if there's market validation, market demand. If there's not, I'm not going to invest in you. If there is, you don't need me. Right? And for the first time in the history of business, we can fully validate a product without actually building it. Very interesting. Just think about that from your product development perspectives. Right? Here's one last example. This is a $100 headset you can get that gives you a pretty good fidelity readout of what brain waves are happening in your brain. On the right is a silhouette of Will Henshaw. He was a guitarist for the Eurythmics, the band from the 1980s. That's me on the left in the silhouette wearing the headset, and that's my brain. What Will is doing is composing music that when you play the music, puts your brain in the zone. So if you need to focus and work on a spreadsheet or PowerPoint or financials, et cetera, this is my brain before and after he plays the music. And you can see my brain flooded with alpha waves, which is the type of brainwave you want, frequency you want in order to be in the zone and focused on the task at hand. It's anti-distraction music, essentially. You can try it out for free. It's up at Focus at Will. He's getting 5 hours per website visit per user average, right? Pretty amazing service. So how do you deal with this? And I want to end this talk by showing how do you juxtapose with this pace of disruptive innovation. We're seeing every part of the business cycle shift to this digital landscape. How many of you are familiar with Airbnb? Right? So Airbnb, you take your extra bedroom and you can turn it into a hotel room. Peter Thiel invested in Airbnb 2 years ago at a market cap of 40% of that of Hyatt Hotels. People thought, you're kind of crazy. This is just a little startup. But if you look at those room nights, that's an exponential curve, right? And he spotted that. So he invested in that. Does anybody know what Airbnb's market cap today is? Today it exceeds that of Hyatt Hotels 2 years later. In 2 years, Airbnb will be the biggest hotel chain in the world. And they don't own any hotel rooms. What a great business to be in, right? I've been studying this phenomenon for about 3 years now. We've found 60 or so organizations that are operating that we call exponential organizations, where they're making a footprint, their footprint their resource footprint is allowing them to achieve 10x or better performance benchmarks compared to their peers. If you're familiar with TED, TED was just a nice high-end conference, about 1,000 people. Chris Anderson took it over. It had plateaued. Many mid-market companies do this. They have early growth and then they plateau a little bit. TED was in that stage. Chris Anderson took it over and he did two things. He released all the TED Talks for free, leveraging rich media, and he allowed anybody in the community to go create a TEDx event. Right? In 5 years, he's created a global media brand. Nobody has ever created a global media brand that quickly, and his cost of doing so was pretty much zero. Right? This is what's possible today. One of our faculty, Robert Goldberg, who was an early executive at Zynga, has been doing this with mid-market companies. He goes into a plateaued mid-market company, leverages one of these characteristics. I've defined a whole set of characteristics of these fast-moving companies. I'll cover a couple of them in the time that I have here. So they leverage one of 5 externalities to grow and scale outside their organization, whether leveraging community or crowd or algorithms, et cetera, et cetera. Then there's 5 internal mechanisms that they use to scale, manage all of that craziness and chaos on an internal control framework basis. We found that if you implement 4 out of the 10, you get that 10x performance improvement. 10x performance improvement. And what Robert is doing is going to mid-market companies saying, let's work with you for a month and implement 2 or 3 out of these. Let's see if we can double your growth rate in a month. If he can, then he comes in with an investment and tries to take a 10x. Over the last 2 years, he's done this with 40 companies. So it shows that there's a process there that you can follow to take a mid-market company, apply some of these attributes, and blow it open. And we've seen many, many opportunities like this. And for large organizations, there's a whole bunch of pieces of advice we have. We don't have time to go into all of these. But basically, you can't take a large organization and turn it into one of these new organizations. It's too disruptive. Essentially, what you can do is take disruptive change makers inside your organizations, the people with really bright ideas, they're very loyal, but they're impossible to manage. And you take them to the edges of the organization and let them do something disruptive there. Apple is maybe the market leader at this from an organizational perspective, and that's one reason why they're one of the biggest companies in the world. I won't go through all of these, but GE, for example, has gone and partnered with these disruptive organizations because trying to buy them or trying to copy them is too hard. Better to partner, invest, and learn from them like they have with Quirky. I'll kind of end here. There are some really interesting dynamics that big companies are starting to take on. We found a company, ING Direct, a bank in Canada, that has implemented a totally decentralized authority model. So a regulated bank in Canada has no job descriptions, no middle management, no CEO, no management layers, no meetings. They operate like a beehive. When you have an online promotion, everybody swarms to the phone banks. When it's regulatory reporting time, everybody swarms to those systems. A normal bank in Canada manages about 10,000 in deposits per employee. They were able to manage 40,000 in deposits per employee just from that one thing. Right? I actually had to fly up there to see it firsthand because I couldn't believe they were able to do it. Amazon's done something really interesting. In many big organizations, it's really easy to say no to a new idea. Right? It's very hard to say yes consistently. And that's why lots of ideas get stopped. So Amazon has a policy called the institutional yes. If you come to me with an idea, my default answer has to be yes. If I want to say no, I have to write a 2-page thesis as to why it's a bad idea and post it publicly internally inside the company. So they've created friction to saying no, and they try out and experiment with that many more ideas. And so we're seeing this very fundamental transformation in how we organize these new companies. The book that I wrote about this came out 2 weeks ago, launched it on CNBC a couple of weeks ago. And I want to show you this. This is the market cap of the fastest growing companies we've been able to spot. And the 2 columns there are the difference from when I started writing the book to when I finished writing the book. And you look at how dramatic the change is in these fast growing organizations just from the beginning. David Rose, one of our faculty, made this point that any company designed for success in the 20th century is doomed to failure in the 21st. We need to organize ourselves in a completely different way. And let me explain the core economic idea behind these new organizations. When you're building a business or running a business, you're worried about managing cost of supply and cost of demand, right? And we try and optimize like hell on both sides of that equation. What the internet did for the first time ever, it allowed us to drop the cost of demand exponentially. Online marketing, referral marketing. If you get an online viral loop, your acquisition costs go really straight to zero, which is a great place to be. These new organizations, these exponential organizations, have figured out how to drop the cost of supply exponentially. So for Airbnb, the marginal cost of adding another hotel room is almost zero. Same with Uber, because it doesn't employ, they don't own their own assets, they're tapping into assets around them, right? Now, when you have no cost of supply and no cost of demand, your company explodes, which is why we're seeing those explosive market caps. And the question for you is, how do you compete with a startup that has no cost of supply? And large organizations are going to have a very tough time with it. I think there's incredible opportunity for mid-market companies. You're already successful, you have good org structures, you have good stability, but there is a very disruptive change coming to how we organize around this. This pace of change is not going to slow down. We had 1 billion people online in 2010. We're going to have 5 billion people online in the next 6 years. And they're all going to have one of these. This is the new Indian Akash tablet. It's a 1 gig Android tablet with a Wi-Fi phone, Bluetooth, etc., and a camera, and it's $35. And it's dropping in price 50% a year. We'll soon be giving these out in cereal boxes because we won't be able to sell anything to those 5 billion people without having one of these. 3 billion new minds are being added to the economy globally. It's the biggest marketplace in the history of mankind coming online, right? That's the opportunity that exists. Thank you very much. Hope you have a great conference. We'll see you soon.